Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozark Mountains. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the autumn of 1891, the Ozark Mountains were a patchwork of fog-draped hollows and red clay roads, the kind that swallowed wagon wheels and secrets alike. Along one of those roads, about 2 miles south of a bend known as Piner's Gap, stood a modest trading post. It was marked on few maps, known to fewer travelers, and remembered by almost no one, except for those who never returned. The locals called it Gentry's Post, though the man who owned it, Elias Gentry, was never seen in town except once a month, when he came down to Harrison to collect supplies. His account book, later found scorched in the remnants of his store, showed dozens of entries between 1887 and 1891, most of them in unfamiliar handwriting. Beneath some names, a single word appeared in faint pencil paid. Beneath others, nothing at all. During that same period, the Ozarks were a land still wrestling with its own ghosts. The Bald Knobbers, a vigilante faction that had emerged after the Civil War, were still spoken of in hushed tones. Their so-called justice had left barns burned, men hanged, and families displaced. Some in Boone County said Gentry himself had once been a nober, or at least had sympathies toward them. Whether that was true or not, his trading post seemed to exist in a kind of no-man's land. Too far from town to be lawful, too close to the hills to be safe. In early November of that year, a hunter named Marcellus Tate filed the first official complaint. His affidavit, preserved in the Boone County Archive, described finding a wagon axle and torn blanket near the creek below Gentry's property. He wrote, "The water ran red, not from rust, but from something freshly washed away. I did not wait to find its source." Constable Henley Rogers rode up to investigate 3 days later. His report was brief. Post appears abandoned. Goods still in place. No sign of Elias Gentry or known employees. Door chained from outside. The last line written in the margin was nearly illegible. Floorboards uneven. Possible pit beneath. No pit was ever excavated, at least not officially. But stories spread quickly through the mountains. Travelers spoke of lantern lights seen flickering after midnight, long after the constable's visit. Others claimed to hear the low hum of a man's voice carried by the wind, murmuring in what sounded like prayer or warning. By the winter of 1892, 6 names had been quietly added to the county's missing persons log, all travelers bound westward who had reportedly stopped for trade. Their families described them as experienced men, trappers, salesmen. One even a schoolteacher from Springfield. None of them were ever found. Local preacher Reverend Caleb Norris later recalled in a sermon that the post was a place of sin built upon the bones of commerce. Few understood what he meant until the spring thaw of 1893, when a group of boys hunting squirrels near the property discovered a small clearing of disturbed soil behind the remains of the store. They thought it was a shallow grave. It was in fact 7. The coroner's notes, now brittle and incomplete, reference partial remains, mixed and inconsistent. Only one skull bore clear markings, a blunt fracture near the crown, as if from the butt of a rifle. No identification tags, no jewelry, nothing but fragments of boot leather and the corner of a ledger page, scorched yet legible, owed 3 nights, 3 meals, 3 men. The sheriff who received that evidence retired within the year. His replacement, a man named Willoughby Crane, quietly ordered the site sealed, and from that moment the name Gentry's Post vanished from county maps altogether. By the time the spring thaw revealed those shallow graves, the locals had already decided what they believed had happened. Some whispered that Gentry had murdered travelers for their goods, then vanished into the hills. Others said he'd been part of something larger, an underground circle of displaced Bald Knobbers, hiding in plain sight beneath the guise of frontier traders. The Ozarks in 1893 were not a place for clear truths. Justice was shaped by rumor, and rumor by fear. The county marshal's office kept its reports lean to avoid panic. But in an unfiled memorandum dated April 6, 1893, one line stands out. The post is quiet now. Even the birds avoid it. When Constable Rogers was questioned months later, he confessed to having returned to the site one last time before retiring. He claimed he found the main door to the store unchained, though no one had officially been there since it was sealed. Inside, he noted, the air was colder than expected, the shelves coated in a fine gray dust despite the windows being shuttered tight. On the counter lay a single object, a brass token bearing the initials EG and the year 1889. It wasn't a coin, nor any known currency. The back bore a crude engraving. No debt left unpaid. That phrase would appear again, scratched into the inside wall of a storage cellar beneath the post when the property was finally opened for legal review in 1895. By then, nature had reclaimed much of it. Ivy wound through the beams, and the roof sagged under decades of mountain rain. The cellar door was found warped and swollen shut, but the boards were pried open by 2 county clerks assigned to inventory whatever remained. What they described in their report reads almost like an inventory from a nightmare crate's half, buried in dirt, filled not with goods but personal effects. Belts, spectacles, fragments of letters. A child's doll with the head missing, and near the far wall, what appeared to be a desk ledger locked with a rusted clasp. The key was found nearby, though the lock itself seemed to crumble at touch. Inside, names were listed again, some familiar from earlier case files. But next to them, instead of sums or weights, there were times of day, after supper, before dawn, twice more. The final entry read, "All debts satisfied. The road is clear." When the clerks turned the pages, they noticed something odd. The ink differed in tone and quality across the months. Experts later determined that at least 3 separate hands had written in the same book. Whether this indicated multiple participants or a gradual descent of one man's mind into disorder was never clarified. A single surviving neighbor, a man named Obadiah Hearst, was interviewed in 1896. His account, recorded by local journalist Warren Clay, appeared briefly in the Harrison Gazette before the issue was withdrawn. Hearst claimed he often heard wagons arriving late at night, long after commerce hours, and saw lanterns descending into the ravine. Sometimes, he said, I'd hear 2 voices going down, but only one coming up. Authorities briefly considered the possibility that Gentry's post had been used as a waypoint for criminal traffic, horse thieves, smugglers, or perhaps fugitives from knobber justice. But no contraband was found and no arrests made. The more officials searched, the less certain they became of what they were searching for. By 1897, the remains from the clearing were quietly interred in a common grave near Bear Creek. The site was left unmarked. Locals say that during the burial, a low fog settled over the hill and did not lift for 3 days. To this day, the county record refers to the incident simply as Case Faith 31, unidentified victims, trading post property. And beneath that, in faint pencil, someone later added a note that still puzzles archivists: no customers after this year. When the century neared its turn, the story of Gentry's post had already begun to fade from formal record, though it survived vividly in the mouths of those who lived closest to the ridge. Travelers avoided the road that cut through Piner's Gap, claiming their horses balked at the scent of smoke that sometimes drifted from the abandoned lot. The land was eventually sold at county auction in 1899 to a cattleman named Robert L. Meeker, who purchased it sight unseen. His reason, recorded in a notary statement, was pragmatic. Timber's good, and the price better. Within months, Meeker's optimism would soar. The deed of sale came with a warning from the previous clerk, one who had helped dismantle the post a few years earlier. "Don't rebuild the cellar," he had said. Meeker ignored it, thinking the superstition typical of rural folk. In early spring, he began to clear the land for grazing and found, to his irritation, that the soil behind the remains of the old structure refused to settle. Every time his men leveled it, the ground sank again by morning, as though something beneath was reclaiming its shape. One of the men, a hired hand named Thaddeus Cole, later testified that the unease grew unbearable after sunset. "It weren't the quiet," he said in his deposition. "It was the kind of quiet that listens back. By midsummer, 2 of his workers had quit, refusing to collect their pay. It was around this time that a new figure entered the story. A federal surveyor named Dr. Horace Bell, assigned to chart the northern Ozarks for resource evaluation. Bell, educated and methodical, was fascinated by the lingering folklore of the Bald Nobers, whose former hideyouts dotted the region. He heard of Gentry's Post through a local innkeeper and visited Meeker's property under the pretense of mapping water access routes. His notes, now preserved in a university archive, contain one of the few rational accounts of the place. The structure's remains are ordinary, he wrote in 1900, yet there exists a distinct disquiet not derived from appearance. Animals refuse to linger near the eastern fence. A faint iron odor persists in the soil even after rainfall. Local accounts border on mania, though they share the same sequence of events. Bell's entry was dated June 2nd, the last day he was confirmed to have been in the area. His disappearance sparked mild attention but no official search, as he was assumed to have moved on to the next county. Months later, a boy fishing along the creek discovered a broken field compass and a notebook page half submerged in the mud. The writing was nearly erased, but one line was still legible: "No one leaves unpaid." After Bell's vanishing, Meeker abandoned the land altogether. He petitioned to void his deed, citing inconsistent ground and recurring trespassers. The county denied the claim, but his family records show that he left Missouri by 1902, resettling in Arkansas under a different name. The property remained unsold for decades. By the first decade of the new century, the tale had shifted from tragedy to cautionary folklore. Old-timers warned travelers not to stop at crossroads where the air smelled of wet copper. They said the hills kept count, and if you lingered too long, your name would be entered in a ledger no living man could erase. An aging constable, when interviewed years later, admitted something rarely shared in print. "Ward burned that post because we couldn't bury what was under it." The ashes, they say, scattered easily, but the soil beneath stayed black. By 1903, the ruins of Gentry's Post had collapsed entirely, the beams swallowed by the hillside. Locals said the earth wanted it gone, and few dared to visit even in daylight. The name Elias Gentry had become a ghost story, spoken by parents to frighten their children into coming home before dark. Yet a handful of officials still treated the matter as unfinished. One of them, Deputy Marshal Ernest Lyle, was newly appointed to Boone County that year and believed the case could still be solved. Lyle had a background in freight accounting. Not law enforcement, but his fascination with unsolved disappearances was well known. He began to gather all surviving records from the case: ledgers, constable notes, and sworn testimonies from the early 1890s. Among them he found the charred ledger page first recovered from the gravesite with the phrase, 3 nights, 3 meals, 3 men. The pattern intrigued him. He suspected the phrase might refer not to services rendered, but to time intervals between murders. According to a memorandum dated October 1903, Lyle visited the site personally. A surviving photograph shows him standing beside a skeletal frame of timber, holding what appears to be a measuring staff. His notes from that visit describe a hollow sound beneath one corner of the old foundation and the distinct presence of metallic odor near the hearth. He ordered a shallow excavation. The workers reported finding fragments of melted tin, broken jars, and something far stranger: a length of wire strung through the earth in a rough grid, forming what might have been a crude trap or restraint. Lyle's supervisor ordered the work halted, fearing public panic. But before the trench was refilled, Lyle claimed to have found an additional piece of evidence: a rusted lockbox buried less than 2 feet deep. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 items: a silver locket with a child's initials, an account chit marked "settled," and a page torn from what looked like a hotel registry. The date on it read August 20, 1891, and beneath it were the names of 3 men: W. Parmer, H. McKee, and C. Dunlin, all matching missing persons from that same year. When Lyle presented the findings to the county board, the reaction was unease rather than relief. One member reportedly told him, "Best to let the hills keep what's theirs." His investigation was quietly closed. Lyle resigned 2 months later, moved north to Springfield, and never spoke publicly of the case again. Years later, however, his daughter donated his personal papers to a local historical society. Among them was a hand-drawn map of the Ozarks with a small X over the spot labeled Old Post. Next to it, in his own handwriting, "No debt left unpaid." Folklore around the area deepened in the following years. Some travelers claimed to see lanterns swinging where no path existed, or to hear the faint rattle of wagon chains when the wind came down the valley. In 1907, a railway worker reported an unexplainable echo beneath his boots while surveying for a potential spur line. "It was like the earth was hollow," he said, "and something inside it was moving." That same year, the Harrison Gazette published a retrospective on the Bald Nobers, recounting their hidden burials and secret tribunals. The article mentioned, almost as a footnote, a trading house at Piners Gap believed to have been one of their lesser posts. Whether this was fact or the editor's flourish, no one could confirm. Yet the timing was notable. Every mention of Gentry's post seemed to resurface when the Nobber's name returned to print, as though the two histories refused to stay separate. By 1910, the last of the surviving witnesses had died or moved away. The property was left to the county for taxes unpaid, fenced off, and erased from official maps once again. But there were those, especially the old miners and trappers who still passed through the Ozarks, who swore that, on certain nights, if the wind was right, you could still smell kerosene and hear the clink of coin on the counter of a store that hadn't stood for 20 years. The first decades of the new century brought change to the Ozarks. Rail lines carved through the valleys, telegraph poles rose like thin bones along the ridges, and the frontier quiet began to fade. But the story of the trading post that never let customers leave refused to die with the old ways. It moved like a sickness through local folklore, told at campfires and schoolyards alike. Children dared each other to ride out past Piners Gap after sundown. Adults didn't need the dare, they already knew better. In 1911, a fire swept through the Boone County Courthouse. Dozens of early records were lost, including several case files related to the Gentry property. The destruction might have erased the story completely, if not for a traveling historian named Dr. Lester Roth, who had copied many of the county's depositions a year earlier for a personal research project on rural justice. Roth was particularly interested in how post-Civil War violence lingered in outlying regions, such as the Bald Knobber territories. His papers later revealed an unsettling curiosity. He had noted striking linguistic similarities between the Knobbers' trial oaths and certain handwritten phrases recovered from Gentry's ledgers. One of those phrases appeared again and again in Roth's correspondence. "Debt is truth." He speculated it might have been a motto or code used among men who believed in punishing betrayal through secrecy. Whether Gentry's post was ever directly tied to that movement or simply mimicked its language remains uncertain. But Routh's letters to colleagues at the University of Missouri suggest he suspected the post had served as a kind of judgment hall, a place where debts, whether moral or monetary, were settled. In 1913, Roth made the journey himself to the Ozarks to verify the accounts. His diary, found decades later in an estate sale, captures a haunting picture of the site. Only a few charred beams remain, yet the air has a texture, thick and metallic. The soil yields easily, as though it remembers hands. He stayed 3 nights at a nearby homestead owned by the Carson family, a line of woodcutters who had lived near Piners Gap since before the war. Their matriarch, Margaret Carson, was known for her blunt memory. When asked if she recalled Gentry or his post, she nodded slowly and said, "He wasn't the worst of them, just the last one caught still breathing." When Routh pressed for clarity, she simply replied, "Those mountains had a way of finishing what lawmen couldn't." 2 weeks after that interview, Roth vanished. His horse was found grazing freely along the creek, his journal left open in the saddlebag. The last entry read, "Lanterns on the ridge again. Voices below. The post calls them still. Roth's disappearance became the final entry in what county records briefly reopened as Case Fair 31A. No further investigation was ever conducted. Officials deemed it a likely misadventure, a polite phrase for lost forever. Yet in the years following his vanishing, a curious pattern emerged. Travelers along the newly built wagon road between Harrison and Forsyth reported seeing a faint light deep among the trees near the old property line. It appeared steady, as though hung on a nail. But when approached, the light would fade, not blink, not vanish suddenly, but slowly dissolve, as though sinking into the ground itself. Folks began calling it the Gentry lamp. They said it was a warning for those who didn't pay their due, though no one could agree what due meant anymore. Some thought it referred to money. Others whispered it meant time, that the postkeeper had struck a bargain with the land, and the land kept collecting. By 1915, the name Gentry's Post was all but forgotten in print, but the hills, it seemed, had never forgotten the men who went missing there. By the 1920s, the Ozarks were beginning to modernize, though modernization in those parts meant little more than graded roads and the occasional telephone wire strung between oak trunks. The new generation of residents had never seen Gentry's Post, but they'd grown up hearing the stories in the same way one learns to fear a cliff, through quiet repetition. The elders rarely mentioned names anymore. They just called it the place where you didn't stop to rest. A rare attempt to put the tale to paper appeared in 1922, when Elias Boone, a regional newspaperman and amateur folklorist, published a serialized column called Ghost Trails of the Ozarks. In one installment, he described a half-buried cellar where a merchant counted debts no man could repay. Though Boone claimed it was pure folklore, his details were alarmingly specific. The mention of a brass token marked e.g., the phrase, 3 nights, 3 meals, 3 men, and the reference to a federal surveyor who never left the mountain. Locals immediately recognized the story's bones, and Boone began receiving letters. Some from readers claiming family connections to the lost travelers, others accusing him of resurrecting cursed ground. Among Boone's letters was one that stood out. Dated May 1923, it was unsigned, written in a careful but shaking hand. The writer insisted that Gentry's Post had not been built by Elias Gentry at all, but by a small cooperative of men, former Bald Nobers who had fled Taney County in 1887 after a series of retaliatory killings. According to the letter, they set up the trading post as both a front and a tribunal site, where anyone who had betrayed the order would be brought to settlement. The writer named no names, but ended with a chilling line. The hills remember their own justice, and sometimes it asks for more. Boone dismissed the letter publicly, but kept it in his private collection. When he died in 1930, the correspondence was found among his papers and donated to the County Historical Society, where it still resides, aged, brittle. In 1926, a construction crew clearing land for a telegraph line near Piner's Gap reported finding fragments of an old stone foundation and several rusted tools buried beneath the loam. Among them was a rusted padlock still clinging to a short length of chain. The crew chief, Harvey Dills, noted that the lock was closed, but without a keyhole, sealed by corrosion or something else. They tossed it aside and continued their work. 2 days later, Dills fell ill with what the local doctor called a mountain fever, a sudden wasting sickness with no clear source. He died within the week, and the lock, by some accounts, disappeared from the worksite entirely. The Ozarks have always been a place where fact and superstition mingle easily. Folks began to whisper that the ground where the telegraph poles stood had been cursed, that the wires themselves carried voices when the wind was still. One lineman swore that while tightening a cable, he heard what sounded like the clink of a store bell. 3 chimes, faint but clear, though no settlement stood within miles. By 1928, the county officially designated the area unsuitable for habitation, due to soil instability and frequent landslides. That decision, however, coincided neatly with a local motion to build a new road that would bypass the old trading route entirely. The real motive, some said, was simpler. The fewer reasons people had to walk past the old site, the better. The last official reference to the Gentry property appeared in an engineering report the following year. The note was brief and easily overlooked. Soil still unsettled, area best left undisturbed, and that, more or less, is how the story might have ended, if not for one final discovery made during the Great Depression, when the hunger for land brought men back into places long since forgotten. The Great Depression drove people into the hills the way drought drives roots deeper into soil. By 1932, families who had lost their farms to the banks began coming through abandoned parcels of land across the Ozarks, searching for any sign of cultivable ground or forgotten lumber. It was during that desperate migration that the Gentry property resurfaced, almost by accident. A man named Emmett Crow, recently widowed and traveling with his teenage sons, stumbled onto the overgrown remains while hunting for usable timber. According to an interview recorded years later by the Works Progress Administration, Crow had no knowledge of the trading post's history. To him, the rotted beams and collapsed cellar were nothing more than a potential source of shelter. They camped there for 3 nights, just long enough for the story to repeat itself. On the first night, Crow's sons claimed to have heard the faint creak of a sign swinging in the dark, though no wind was moving through the trees. On the second, one of the boys found what he described as a line of glass jars, buried beneath the ashes of the old hearth. Inside each was something unrecognizable, mud, stones, and what might have been hair. The third night, Crow himself wrote in his pocket diary that he saw a faint light, low and steady, as though someone was holding a lantern inside the ground. By dawn, his younger son was gone. A search party was formed by the few remaining settlers in the area. They found the boy's boot prints leading toward the creek, and stopping abruptly near a patch of freshly collapsed soil. The depression was shallow but smooth, like a sinkhole. They dug until the ground grew soft and the smell turned metallic. What they unearthed wasn't the boy, but a wooden crate, perfectly preserved, bound by wire. Inside were fragments of ledgers, scraps of cloth, and a brass token marked E.G. The sheriff at the time, Lemuel Vann, ordered the crate taken to Harrison for examination. But before it reached town, the wagon overturned on a narrow pass, spilling its contents into the ravine below. The deputy escorting it claimed he heard something as the crate split open. "Like a sigh," he said, "or a man counting." The case of the missing Crow boy was closed quietly. Presumed drowned. The report read, though no water lay near where the trail ended. Emmett Crow moved his surviving son east to Springfield, where he worked in a mill until his death in 1941. His descendants later sold his belongings at auction. Among them was the same pocket diary he'd kept in 1932. The final entry, dated the morning his boy vanished, reads, "The ground keeps shifting. It wants what it lost." The rediscovery of the property during the Depression brought the legend of Gentry's Post roaring back into local talk. Old-timers who'd lived through the earlier decades shook their heads, saying it was bound to happen. "That place never stays buried," said one former constable, by then too frail to travel, but still clear of mind. "It waits for hungry men, because hungry men will always dig." Interestingly, this renewed attention also drew in outsiders, writers, folklorists, and opportunists who smelled a story worth printing. One of them, Harlan Dow, arrived in 1934 claiming to be researching the unrecorded economies of the postbellum Ozarks. What he found, or what found him, would keep the Gentry name alive for another generation and ensure that the ledger, once again, was opened. Dow would later describe the ruins in his manuscript as half swallowed by the earth but still breathing. Like a creature asleep. He wasn't far off. The land around Piner's Gap had never truly settled, and whatever had taken root there, be it guilt, memory, or something older, still held its accounts. When Harlan Dow arrived in the Ozarks in 1934, he was 30 years old and already known among small town papers for his fascination with unsolved crimes. He had a sharp, unhurried voice and a tendency to phrase even mundane facts like they belonged to the twilight. To him, the story of Gentry's Post was perfect material, a forgotten cold case left to rot in the hills. But what began as research soon turned into something stranger. His personal journals, discovered decades later in a library attic in Little Rock, record his initial impressions of the place. "The air smells of old iron," he wrote. "The trees lean toward the ruins as if listening." He spent his first week collecting testimony from surviving locals, few of whom were willing to talk. The Carson family, now nearly all gone, refused to open their door. Others told him the same phrase in different ways. "The land doesn't want to be remembered." Still, Dow persisted. He mapped what remained of the foundation stones, cross-referenced the known disappearances, and unearthed references to Elias Gentry in a handful of supply invoices from Harrison. Gentry's purchases had been modest: flour, nails, oil, except for one recurring item: rope by the spool. The discovery unsettled Dow. In one letter to his editor he wrote, if trade was his purpose, he traded in something heavier than goods. That same week, he uncovered the remnants of a wagon rut descending from the ridge to the creek, an older, unrecorded route that bypassed the main road entirely. Following it led him to what he first mistook for a natural sinkhole. But beneath a layer of dead leaves, his lantern revealed the edge of timber, a trapdoor. The door itself was sunken and fused to the earth, impossible to lift. Dow sketched its outline, measured the perimeter, and noted the peculiar cold radiating from it. His journal for June 18th records the moment vividly. "There is air coming from below, steady and cold. It smells of stone dust and time." He sent a telegram to his editor promising a story that would wake the hills. But the dispatch office never received it. Dow was last seen by a farmer named Hiram Lee, walking down the valley trail near sunset, his lantern already lit though daylight still lingered. When he failed to return to his boarding house in Harrison, a brief search was launched. They found his camp intact, his notebooks stacked neatly beside the remains of a fire that hadn't burned in days. His camera, an Eastman folding model, contained 3 exposed plates. Only 2 survived the humidity. One showed the collapsed ruins of the post. The other, grainy and uneven, captured what appeared to be a handprint on a wooden door pressed from the inside. The investigation ended with no conclusive findings. The sheriff's report listed Dow as missing, presumed lost in terrain. The locals had another view. They said he'd gone too deep, both literally and in spirit. "He tried to tally the untallied," said one of the older Carson relatives. "The hills don't let that kind of arithmetic stand." Years later, when his journals surfaced, scholars debated whether Dow's final entries were the product of stress, isolation, or something else entirely. His handwriting changed, letters elongated, words began looping into one another, and the final line before the notebook ends reads, "The ledger is still open." After Dow's disappearance, a small group of university historians briefly attempted to locate the trapdoor he described. They found only soft earth, a scatter of blackened stones, and a faint depression the shape of a cellar mouth. One of the team remarked that their compass needles spun oddly near the site, refusing to settle. The Ozark papers didn't bother printing the story. Too many disappearances had already come from that patch of earth, and in the years that followed, the woods began to grow thicker, the paths narrower, until even the hunters stopped venturing that far west. The trading post, they said, had at last taken its final payment, one for curiosity. By 1938, the name Harlan Dow had become another rumor folded into the larger legend of Gentry's Post. Locals avoided mentioning him directly, instead referring to him as the man with the lantern. Even so, a quiet interest stirred among regional historians. One of them, Professor Abner Lyle of the University of Arkansas, gathered the surviving clippings, Dow's notes, and the Harrison Sheriff's files to compile what he called the Ledger of the Lost. Lyle's purpose was not sensational. He was a careful man, known for his work cataloging early Ozark settlements. Yet in his preface, he hinted at something beyond anthropology. This case has the peculiar texture of memory itself. Layers of record, half-rotted, still bleeding through. Lyle traced the post's origins back to 1879, when Elias Gentry first applied for a mercantile license in Boone County. His registration bore the faint seal of the county clerk and listed no family members, only one associate, a man named Jonas Kipp, whose name does not appear in any census. Both men vanished from documentation after 1888, the year the disappearances began. Through careful comparison, Lyle noted that the handwriting on Gentry's supply receipts matched that of Kipp's signature. It may have been one man using two names. He wrote, a trick common among transient traders. Among Dow's recovered artifacts was a short note, apparently torn from the ledger itself. 3 left by Dawn, no return, no credit. The handwriting, too, matched both signatures. Professor Lyle's study might have remained a footnote had it not been for what happened during his second field trip. He and 2 assistants returned to the site in late October, bringing ground rods and measuring tools. In his surviving correspondence, Lyle describes a sudden metallic resonance beneath the soil. It rang like a bell when struck. He wrote, though there was no hollow visible ground, no vault nor pipe. They dug for several hours before uncovering a square of iron plating, deeply corroded. Beneath it, a cavity opened, large enough for a man to crouch within. They found only fragments, a clay bottle, a charred length of rope, and what Lyle called powdery residue not unlike ash. That night, Lyle's assistants camped near the site while the professor took his notes to a farmhouse 2 miles away. By morning, the camp was empty. The professor returned to find the fire burned low, the tents collapsed, and both men gone. Only a single boot was recovered from the creek bank. Lyle did not remain in the Ozarks after that. He returned to Fayetteville, submitted a terse withdrawal letter from his university position, and never published the manuscript. Decades later, a janitor cleaning out his office found a stack of papers tied with baling twine, marked simply, for the drawer, not the shelf. Among them was a typewritten summary. It is my belief the trading post was less a store than a conduit, a place between places built for exchange not of goods, but of lives. The ledgers, the ropes, the careful anonymity of its keeper all point to a pattern of human bartering, not commerce as we know it. Historians dismissed the note as the product of exhaustion. Yet the tone of the writing, cold, deliberate, and strangely impersonal, made some suspect that Lyle's reasoning had not entirely left him. In later years, the property title passed quietly into state ownership. The records describe it as unfit for development. Locals claimed that when surveyors came through in the 1940s, their equipment misread elevation levels and magnetic headings. The compasses went wild again. One foreman said, "You couldn't tell north from west out there." The last mention of the site in any official record came in a 1947 forestry memo. The area once known as Gentry Hollow remains overgrown and prone to sudden fog formations, even in dry months. The note ended with a recommendation to restrict public access. No reason was given, none was needed. Those who lived nearby already understood. The post was gone, but the ground still hummed when struck. The forest around the old trade road had nearly reclaimed itself by the time the war years arrived. The 1940s brought soldiers home, and with them came stories. Men who had traveled farther than their fathers ever dreamed, only to return to the Ozarks and find their own valleys unfamiliar. Among those veterans was Robert Hensley, a quiet mechanic from Berryville who often spent his weekends hiking the ridges in solitude. In 1949, Hensley wrote to the Arkansas Gazette describing a discovery west of the old timber route, near a stream that runs too cold for the season. The letter was never published, but it survived in the Gazette's archive files. In it, he mentioned finding a sunken platform of wood and iron, black as tar, with markings like tally marks or hatchings carved into the rim. He had pried up a section with his knife and glimpsed a void below. He didn't linger. 2 weeks later, he told his wife he planned to take a camera and return in daylight. He never came home. His pickup was found parked beside the river, the driver's door open, a single boot print visible in the mud before it disappeared into the brush. The county sheriff, remembering the old stories, refused to send deputies into the ravine after sunset. They searched in daylight only, combing the woods for 3 days before calling it off. In the report, The sheriff wrote, "Terrain unstable, possible sinkhole." But the deputies who'd grown up in those hills knew better. One of them, Ernest Cope, said later in an interview, "We weren't looking for a man. We were looking for a place that didn't want to be found." The missing mechanic's wife sold their property and moved to Little Rock. But for a decade afterward, hunters claimed to hear metallic noises in that part of the woods, like the sound of a gate clanging below ground. In 1957, when a flash flood tore through Boone County, the riverbank near that same ravine collapsed. Among the debris was a warped wooden plank, half charred, with faint letters burned into it, "Post, Gent." The fragment was collected by a forestry officer and logged without context. It was stored in a regional archive for 20 years before anyone noticed the carving matched Dow's sketches. That rediscovery revived academic interest for a brief moment. A graduate student named Lucy Warren, working under the supervision of a historian at Fayetteville, proposed a paper comparing the Gentry Post disappearances with similar late 19th century trading site vanishings in the Missouri Ozarks. She connected them to the Bald Nobers period, a time when justice and violence often blurred. Her thesis suggested that Gentry's Post might have operated as an informal holding place for outlaws or informants, people who were meant never to reappear. Warren's research gained attention, particularly when she uncovered a ledger fragment held privately by a collector in Springfield. It contained partial names: Carson M. 2 loads corn, Lee Hiram 1 mule, unsettled. Both men were tied to the old testimonies, but below those, written in smaller script, was a final line, "Debt carried beneath." Warren photographed the page, wrote her notes, and sent the images to her advisor. That was the last correspondence received from her. She failed to return from her summer trip to document the site. No official search was mounted. She was presumed lost during hiking. The letter mailed days before her disappearance contained only one postscript in pencil. "The ground feels like it's breathing." The university sealed her project and never published the findings. When her advisor, now elderly, was later interviewed, he admitted something odd about the photographs. "They were sharp," he said, "except for the corners. The corners were always blurred, as if the paper itself was moving." The ledger vanished soon after from the collector's archive. No theft was reported. It was simply missing, much like those who had gone looking for it. And so the trail that had stretched from Elias Gentry's quiet little store in 1879 through Dow's obsession in 1934 now reached into mid-century, still taking names, still unbalanced. Whatever ledger existed, whatever debts it kept, was not yet closed. By the early 1960s, Gentry Hollow was a name known only to surveyors, folklore enthusiasts, and the few families who had refused to move from the hills. The forest had thickened to near impenetrable density, and the dirt road that once traced the river had crumbled to a rough footpath. The area was marked on county maps with a simple notation: unstable ground, no road access. That should have been the end of the story. But in 1963, a young reporter for the Springfield News leader Ellen Berridge stumbled across the forgotten file while researching a feature on Ozark legends. She described the first night she read through the old testimonies. It felt less like history than something half awake, waiting to finish a sentence. Berridge was methodical. She cross-referenced the names from the Gentry files with marriage and death records, tracing descendants of both the Carson and Lee families. Nearly all lines ended abruptly around 1900, though one elderly woman, Irene Lee, granddaughter of Hiram Lee, still lived near Harrison. Berridge visited her in June. The transcript of that interview, preserved in her personal papers, remains one of the last first-hand recollections of the Post's reputation. "My granddaddy said the Post wasn't right," Irene told her. "He said it was built on the same ground where folks used to leave their debts in blood. The Bald Nobers used to come through, dragging men behind their horses. Some went in that store and never came back out. Said the man inside knew how to make you vanish without a scream." When Berridge asked if her grandfather ever went inside, Irene shook her head. "He said the light there wasn't natural. like a lantern burning behind a curtain, but you could never see what was casting it. Later that week, Berridge drove into the hills to photograph the site. Her final dispatch, dated June 18, was brief, arrived at Gentry Hollow. Fog heavy even before dusk. Locals call it the hollow that hears. She enclosed a single roll of film and promised to send her notes upon return. Neither she nor the film reached the newsroom. 3 days later, her car was found in a ditch 6 miles from the hollow. The passenger door was ajar, her typewriter still in the back seat, ribbon snapped and paper rolled halfway out with the last words, "Ledge." The paper was torn after the G. A search party of volunteers scoured the woods for 4 days. They found one of her shoes, half buried near the creek, and a rusted camera tripod standing upright in the soil. No other trace emerged. The case remained open until 1968, then quietly archived, but the camera roll, recovered much later from a mislabeled evidence box, contained 4 photographs. The first showed the familiar tree line, the second a clearing of stones partially covered in fog. The third, darker, revealed the faint outline of a square depression in the earth. The fourth was nearly black except for a small reflection at the center, like a mirror catching a lantern's glow. That image was enlarged in the newsroom years later, and according to one editor, revealed the suggestion of faces behind the light. He destroyed the print the same day. After Berridge's disappearance, Gentry Hollow was fenced off by the county. A single sign was posted, "Non Autorisatia USF Area." Over the decades, the fence rusted and fell, but the warning lived on through word of mouth. Those who did wander close in later years described a strange pressure in their ears, as if descending underwater, and a faint metallic echo underfoot when the wind died. "Like stepping over a grate," one hunter said. Except there's no grate there. The ledger remained unseen, but its presence, unwritten yet undeniable, lingered in the silence of the hollow, as if the land itself was still keeping accounts. In the autumn of 1974, a forestry team surveying mineral content along the Missouri-Arkansas border made an unscheduled detour into Gentry Hollow. They were mapping limestone formations, not ghost stories, and had no idea of the land's history. The leader of the team, Dr. Marcus Ingers, later submitted a brief technical report that, though clinically phrased, revealed small inconsistencies that would soon attract attention. The report noted a faint but consistent subsurface cavity detected by seismic probe approximately 10 meters below grade, rectangular in dimension, with a shallow resonance pattern suggesting hollowed timber or brick. Yet the survey was never completed. Their instruments began malfunctioning halfway through the second day. Compasses spun, batteries drained. The men complained of headaches and disorientation. One assistant, Paul Granger, wrote privately in his notebook, "The woods feel electric. The ground buzzes when you stand still." He described hearing what he thought was running water beneath the soil, though there were no streams on the map. When they packed up, Ingers reported a persistent echo following their footsteps, as though sound were being reflected upward from under the ground. They left the site abruptly on October 3rd. The equipment readings, half finished, were filed away, and the project was reassigned. But one technician, Thomas Baird, stayed behind for several hours after the others left. He was curious about the hollow cavity. According to Granger's later statement, Baird said he wanted to listen to it a little longer. He was never seen again. The state declined to investigate, calling it a solo misadventure. Baird's family petitioned for a renewed search, but the terrain was unstable from seasonal rains, and access was denied. Within a year, the case was closed. 2 decades later, during a museum exhibit on Ozark folklore, a visitor claimed to have found an old photograph in a Harrison estate sale showing a man in field clothes, standing near a sinkhole, looking straight down. The caption written on the back reads simply, "T. Baird, 1974. The photograph was grainy, nearly washed out by glare. But around the man's boots was a faint circular shadow, as though light were seeping upward from below. The image was displayed briefly before being withdrawn at the family's request. Meanwhile, the old bald Nober's archives, then being digitized by Missouri historians, revealed a chilling parallel. Among the vigilante group's seized materials was an 1886 ledger listing deliveries received at post near the Ridge Road. 4 accounted, 2 unmarked. The description matched both the geography and the era of Gentry's post. Some researchers suggested the unmarked entries might have referred to extrajudicial killings, but others argued the phrasing hinted at a place that served dual purposes: trading by day, punishment ground by night. That connection revived Gentry Hollow's notoriety. Newspapers briefly revisited the story under headlines like "The Ozark Store That Ate Its Guests." Locals hated the attention, saying it stirred old ground. For a while, trespassers began sneaking into the area at night, carrying tape recorders, looking for proof. One such group, 3 college students, entered the hollow in 1978. Only one made it back. The survivor, interviewed anonymously in 1980, claimed they had heard a steady knocking under the dirt, and that their flashlights flickered in rhythm. He said his friends had been walking just a few feet ahead when the ground moved like a lung. Authorities dismissed the story as hysteria brought on by fear and poor footing. But in the sheriff's logbook for that week, a handwritten note, unsigned, appeared. Soil around creek edge collapsed again. Strong smell of oil or pitch, and beneath it, another line in a different hand, written faintly, almost as an afterthought: ledger still open. No one claimed responsibility for that addition, yet it was written in ink identical to what had been used in the 1890s County Register, an ink formula long discontinued. By the winter of that same year, the hollow was once again sealed off, fences rebuilt, and the incident forgotten. But the archive copies of the Ingers report and the Bald Nober's ledger fragment, stored in separate facilities, began to exhibit the same peculiarity noted decades earlier in Dow's journals, the text at the edges of each page slowly fading, as if the paper itself were erasing the record. The balance sheet, it seemed, was still being adjusted. The years drifted on, and by the mid-1980s, Gentry Hollow had become something between a forgotten corner of county land and a whispered dare among teenagers. The original fence had long since rusted away, and the woods that once stood open beneath thin pines were now thick with oak and undergrowth. Yet every few years the hollow reasserted itself, never loudly, always in small, precise ways. In 1984, an amateur radio operator named Clint Mercer reported receiving metallic interference while scanning shortwave frequencies one night from his cabin near the ridge. He described the pattern as a rhythmic pulse 5 seconds apart, identical to a telegraph key. Assuming it was stray electrical feedback, Mercer tried to triangulate the signal. To his surprise, it came from the approximate location of the hollow. He logged the coordinates in his notebook and broadcast a reply in Morse WSO Sindinge. According to his log, a single word came back after a pause: a weed. Mercer's wife later confirmed that he had laughed about it, assuming a prank, but he drove out the next morning, just to see. His truck was discovered 2 days later, engine still warm, door open, key in ignition. The local paper noted that the vehicle was found less than 100 yards from the old Gentry Foundation, but made no mention of any signal. His radio set, however, was missing. That same summer, the Boone County Historical Society organized a display called Ozarks of Industry and Isolation. A small case contained reproductions of ledgers and letters from the 1880s trading routes. One of the curators, Diana Truitt, added a note in the exhibit book: visitors have commented on an unusual low vibration near the case display. Checked lights and mounts. No mechanical source found. Her entry might have meant nothing, but the following week she fell ill with a sudden fever and resigned shortly after. When she cleared her desk, she left a single envelope addressed to her supervisor. Inside was a carbon copy of Mercer's shortwave log. No one could explain how she obtained it. In the winter that followed, the hollow once more found itself in the news. A brush fire burned through part of the ridge, revealing long buried objects, square stones laid in deliberate rows. A forestry crew cataloged them as retaining wall remnants, though one worker remarked that the arrangement looked too neat for a collapse. Beneath the stones was a faint wooden beam, blackened but intact. The scent of oil hung thick in the cold air. One of the firefighters, Eddie Crane, later told his wife that when he leaned down to pry up a fragment, he heard what sounded like distant voices echoing through the ground. Not words, he said, just counting, over and over, like an adding machine working itself. He never returned to the site. By 1986, renewed attention led the county to reissue access restrictions, citing hazardous terrain and unstable subsurface cavities. But privately, those who had handled the survey noted one more anomaly. The soil temperature inside the hollow remained an even 58 degrees year-round, warmer than the surrounding area, even in deep winter. A geologist explained it as trapped groundwater or geothermal seepage. Locals thought otherwise. "That's bookkeeping heat," said one old farmer when interviewed. Old debts don't cool easy. After the fire, the hollow was quiet again. No more signals, no strange fires, no survey teams. Yet in the following spring, when hikers came across the site's new warning sign, they noticed the wooden post seemed oddly fresh, its grain unweathered, the carving deep and sharp. At the bottom corner, below the official lettering, someone had burned two faint initials, e.g., no one claimed responsibility for replacing the sign, and the county denied ordering it. But one of the rangers swore the letters hadn't been there the week before. That summer, the trees began to die in a slow, circular pattern around the clearing, like something below was drawing the roots downward. The forest, it seemed, was keeping its own form of accounting. By the time the 1990s rolled in, Gentry Hollow had turned into a forgotten footnote, the kind of place that old men mentioned in diner conversations but never with certainty. "It's back there somewhere," they'd say, pointing vaguely toward the misted hills west of Harrison. Yet its legend quietly threaded into the growing folklore tourism of the Ozarks. Ghost walks, abandoned mines, and frontier mysteries now retold under electric lanterns for curious travelers. In 1991, a graduate filmmaker named Caleb Roston set out to create a short documentary on hone-marked disappearances in frontier trading towns. He wasn't a believer in folklore. He was after atmosphere. The plan was simple: drive the old county roads, film the ruins, splice in narration from period diaries. Gentry Hollow was supposed to be just one segment among many. Roston arrived that July with a crew of 2 students, a rented Super 16 camera, and a map printed from the state archives. They shot along the ridge, capturing miles of wild grass and collapsing stone walls. On their 3rd day, they found the clearing, or what was left of it. One of his crew members, Marta Gaines, described it later in an affidavit. "The ground dipped in like a shallow bowl, and there was this hum in the air, like the power lines before a storm." The footage they captured that afternoon was never publicly released, but Gaines' sworn statement detailed the events. "We were setting up near the tree line when Caleb went down into the center of the clearing. He stopped suddenly and said, 'Do you hear it breathing?' Then his mic cut out. All the sound went dead on playback. Total silence, even though we had wind, insects, everything." The team packed up fast, unnerved but unhurt. That evening, Roston insisted on reviewing the film. The first few reels were ordinary: woods, mist, sunlight slanting through branches. But one shot, taken just before the camera glitched, showed something none of them could explain. In the far background of the frame, behind Roston, was a wooden structure. It appeared for 2 seconds only, a shape like a storefront, with an open doorway and a signboard hanging at an angle. The lettering couldn't be made out. The next morning, Roston returned alone, saying he wanted a clean daylight shot of the illusion. He left the camp at 6:15 a.m. and was never seen again. Authorities later located his camera 30 yards from the hollow's center. The film inside had melted, though there was no sign of fire. A single audio fragment survived on a backup recorder. The sound lasted less than 3 seconds. A creak, like a hinge turning, followed by what might have been the closing of a heavy book. The project was abandoned. Gaines left filmmaking entirely, later writing that the experience felt like being erased from the inside out. The university sealed the reels in an archive under restricted access, citing ethical concerns. But years later, one still frame from Roston's footage leaked into a 1998 local history magazine. It showed the hollow at sunset, the silhouette of the trees forming a dark ring around a brighter patch of earth. At the very center, near where Roston had been standing, there was a shape, angular, vertical, and faintly human, bending forward as if to pick something up. No digital analysis ever clarified what it was, and with that, Gentry Hollow receded once again into silence. Only one more entry would appear in public record for decades afterward, a maintenance note in the county's infrastructure log from 1999. Bridge repairs delayed due to unstable ground near Old Gentry Route. Crew reports hollow sound beneath soil. No further excavation recommended. The signature at the bottom of that note was barely legible, but one archivist later observed that it appeared to read H. Dow, in handwriting that had not existed for over 60 years. At the turn of the millennium, Gentry Hollow had become the kind of story that flickered between myth and memory, something whispered at summer bonfires or used to scare scouts into staying near camp. Yet even as the modern world crept closer, with highways stretching through the Ozarks and cell towers rising over the valleys, the hollow remained untouched. Survey drones avoided it, GPS signals jittered or went blank. Then in 2003, the state's environmental department undertook a soil stability assessment of old county land tracts. The engineer assigned, Dr. Sarah Minton, was a pragmatic woman, trained in geology, skeptical of folklore, and methodical to a fault. Her team arrived in May, with digital scanners and bore drills, expecting nothing more than routine readings. Her field notes began like any other report: site temperature steady at 58 F, soil dense but uneven, strong ferromagnetic anomaly at depth of 1 ms. But over the next few days, her entries grew strange. One technician's compass spun endlessly. Another complained of vertigo. Minton herself noted a mild resonance at 3S detectable through seismic sensors, possibly groundwater flow. She dismissed it at first, until one of the ground microphones picked up something else. It was faint, a pattern buried beneath the static of Earth's natural hum. Minton wrote, 3 short pulses, 1 long, repeats every 42 seconds, may correspond to rhythmic vibration from underground cavity. But when she compared the data with known geological models, there was no match. On their 4th night, camped near the hollow, a technician named Alvarez claimed to hear what sounded like the echo of a wooden latch closing, though no wind moved the trees. They joked about ghosts, then returned to work. At dawn, Alvarez was gone. His cot lay undisturbed, flashlight still beside it. Minton filed an emergency report and suspended operations. The official record lists unsafe terrain, likely cave-in. Yet in her private notebook, recovered years later when her estate was donated to the university, Minton wrote a single line not included in the report. Sound beneath soil identical to telegraph code OWED. Those were the same letters transmitted by Clint Mercer's radio in 1984. The project was quietly terminated. Minton resigned the following year and left the state. Before departing, she mailed a sealed envelope to her former mentor at the University of Missouri, containing only a USB drive and a handwritten note. Don't open unless it starts again. The contents of that drive remain unknown. The package was never found after her mentor's death in 2011. That same year, hikers on an unmarked trail near the hollow reported a collapsed section of earth after a heavy storm. Within the crater, they saw a frame of old timbers, stacked like cellar walls. One man swore he glimpsed a reflection inside, like glass, but moving. The next day, when they returned with others, the pit had filled with mud and leaves as if it had never been there. By then, the story had returned to digital life. Online forums about lost towns and haunted commerce circulated grainy satellite images, claiming to show faint rectangular shadows under the canopy. Posts discussing Gentry's post often ended abruptly. Accounts deleted. Images replaced by blank gray squares. A moderator of one such forum said the metadata on the deleted posts contained the same repeating phrase, "Debt carried beneath." When journalists from the Ozark Tribune reached out to the state archive for comment, they were told There are no files by that designation. That property was never zoned. But the map from 1879, the one Elias Gentry filed with his mercantile license, still sits in the Boone County Record Vault. In the faint corner, under decades of grime, is an annotation scrawled in different ink, account kept open by request. No clerk ever signed it. The handwriting again matches none other than Elias Gentry's. By 2015, the legend of the Gentry Trading Post had become an academic curiosity, a blend of folklore, missing persons, and historical record gaps that intrigued researchers but yielded no proof. That year, Dr. Leonard Parrish, a cultural anthropologist from the University of Arkansas, proposed a field study titled Commerce and Isolation in Ozark Settlements, 1850-1900. One chapter would explore the lost post of Gentry Hollow. Parrish approached the project as pure ethnography. He wanted to separate what he called ritualized fear from documentable history. He gathered oral accounts from nearby towns, descendants of loggers, trappers, and homesteaders who'd lived within a day's walk of the hollow. To his surprise, nearly every family still repeated some version of the same phrase, not as ghost story, but as local warning. If you trade there, one farmer's widow told him, you don't bargain, you balance. The wording puzzled Parrish. Balance what? He asked. The woman simply tapped her temple. What you think is yours. By autumn. Parrish and two graduate assistants set up a temporary research cabin near the perimeter of Gentry Hollow. They brought ground-penetrating radar, old county plats, and a box of microfilmed ledgers from the 1890s. What they found in those ledgers unsettled even the skeptical professor. Between 1888 and 1891, a dozen entries appeared under Gentry Mercantile, small transactions for flour, kerosene, and tobacco. Every one of them had the same closing notation, settled upon receipt. The handwriting, according to Parrish's archivist, changed slightly across months, as if more than one clerk had kept the books. But in the final entry, dated October 12, 1891, the handwriting reverted to the original script, the same looping strokes found on Elias Gentry's personal correspondence. And the note beside it read simply, all accounts balanced. It was the same month the trading post vanished from record. The assistants documented everything, scanning the ledger pages and cross-referencing them with property tax records. No successor business existed. The Gentry family line officially ended in 1893, 2 years later, when the last relative, a niece named Helen Gentry, was reported drowned in a creek north of Jasper. Parrish's notes from that final week in the field are fragmented but chillingly consistent. On October 14th, his graduate assistant Lyle Trent recorded that their measuring equipment kept resetting to 100 by hour each time they pointed toward the hollow. 2 nights later, the group was awakened by what sounded like wooden shutters banging, though their cabin had none. On the morning of October 18th, Parrish's last entry was logged on a field tablet. It read, ground pulse returned. Same pattern Dr. Minton described. I believe this is mechanical, not natural. If so, then there's structure still operating below us, something generating regular oscillation. But it's timed like breath. After that entry, no further logs were made. The research team was discovered 5 days later by a forest ranger. Their cabin was intact, equipment undamaged. All 3 researchers were found asleep at their desks, unresponsive but alive. Hospital tests reported no toxins or injuries. When they awoke, none could recall the missing days. Parrish resigned from the university shortly after, moved to Maine, and refused all interviews. One assistant later confided anonymously to a journalist that she'd begun hearing a sound when near electronics. Faint, rhythmic, and always in threes. It's like a ledger being flipped open, she said, and something waiting for the next name. That interview was never published. In the years since, the hollow remains unmarked on digital maps. When viewed by satellite, the forest canopy shows a single irregular patch, roughly the size of a small shop, where no trees grow. Locals say the soil there is too unsettled for roots to take hold. Others say the ground refuses to close. In 2018, a journalist named May Caldwell, working for a regional history podcast, decided to revisit Gentry Hollow. Her series, Unfound Arkansas, specialized in forgotten towns and unmarked tragedies. She'd heard whispers of the parish case, but couldn't access the university's sealed files. So she turned to the surviving locals, mostly older residents who still referred to the hollow in lowered voices. Caldwell's field notes were recovered later from her cloud archive. They begin methodically, like any journalist's outline. Goal: retrace archival trail from Elias Gentry's Trading Post 1891 to Parish Expedition 2015. Identify link between debt-related folklore and missing persons pattern. Her first recording was made on March 2, 2018, from her rental car parked along the Forgotten County Road that once led into the hollow. Road impassable after mile 3, she says in the log. Trees too dense. Fog heavier than expected. Temperature drop within minutes. Caldwell interviewed 3 residents of nearby Kingston. One of them, Mrs. Joan Leary, recalled her grandmother's warning never to pass the post after sundown. When pressed, Leary added, "The hollow remembers what it's owed. Always has." The phrase matched that same cryptic code, OWED, from Minton's seismic logs and Mercer's radio transmission decades before. Caldwell documented everything carefully. Her last known correspondence, sent to her editor on March 8, included a scanned image from the Boone County Archives. It showed a faded receipt dated June 23, 1891, bearing the signature of Elias Gentry and a note in the margin. 2 shirts, 1 lantern, 3 pounds meal. Paid with promise. She wrote beneath it, could refer to the barter system. But something about that phrasing feels off. Paid with promise. Not on promise. Almost contractual. As if the payment itself wasn't finished. On March 10th, she hiked the route alone. Her GPS trail stopped transmitting at 2:47 p.m. When park rangers later followed her path, they found her pack. Camera, microphone, and field recorder intact. Resting at the base of a slope. No sign of struggle, no animal tracks, no blood. The last recording on the device lasted 8 minutes. The first 5 are ordinary footsteps, wind, rustling leaves. Then, faintly, something else, the sound of distant wood creaking, steady and slow, like a porch swinging on old chains. At the 7-minute mark, Caldwell's voice trembles. "There's a building here. It's standing." Seconds later, the doors open. After that, silence. Then a final line, barely audible under the static. "Ledger's still warm." That was the last anyone heard from her. The recorder was sent to the State Police Lab in Little Rock. Analysis confirmed no tampering. The creaking sounds matched the acoustic pattern of wooden joints under weight, as though a structure were shifting against the ground. Yet no physical building was ever found. Her disappearance drew brief media attention before being folded into Arkansas's long list of wilderness vanishings. Officially, the case remains open. But 6 months later, a small package arrived at the Unfound Arkansas office with no return address. Inside was a strip of old photograph film, the kind used in the early 1900s. When developed, it showed 3 overexposed figures standing before a wooden storefront. The shop's signboard read only, "Trading Post." The image was analyzed by experts who dated the film stock to circa 1890. Yet the last detail unsettled even skeptics. Faintly, at the far right of the frame, stood a modern woman in hiking clothes, half turned toward the door. Her outline matched Caldwell's build exactly. No one could explain how her likeness appeared on film manufactured a century before her birth. The negative now sits in the State Archive, sealed under restricted access, labeled Artifact GH 1891, and Gentry Hollow, once a place of commerce and welcome, remains the one trading post in the Ozarks that never truly closed its doors. By the winter of 2021, the Ozark forests had changed. Logging roads sealed, new conservation laws in place, yet Gentry Hollow remained untouched, as though time itself refused to trespass. The satellite imagery from that year showed something new, a faint grid beneath the soil, rectangular depressions aligned like rooms in a structure. But when the forestry department sent a surveyor, the pattern was gone. The ground, they said, had shifted again. The last official attempt to document the site came from a small team of historical cartographers. One of them, Professor Henry Weller, summarized their findings in a private letter to a colleague. would confirm traces of brick and timber consistent with late 19th century construction. Yet beneath the surface, we detected a magnetic alignment that suggests, oddly, a consistent return to zero. It's as if the Earth rejects measurement here. Every compass, every meter, resets. The data disappears the moment it's written. He never returned to the site. What remains of the legend now is a patchwork of paper, receipts, journals, affidavits, spread across county archives and private estates. Together, they sketch the outline of something that began as a simple trading post and ended as a wound in the land. Elias Gentry's enterprise, once praised for fairness and hospitality, became a name whispered only in caution. Some modern folklorists interpret the story as symbolic, a parable about debt and greed, the moral toll of commerce in an age of desperation. They point to the Bald Nobers, the vigilante group active in the Ozarks during the same era, whose violent sense of justice left towns fearful of outsiders. Perhaps, they argue, the Gentry legend was born from that atmosphere of suspicion and isolation. But others disagree. A few who have wandered close to the hollow at dusk report hearing rhythmic thuds beneath their boots. Not thunder, not animal steps, but something like a slow, deliberate heartbeat under the ground. One hiker said it grew louder when she stepped closer to the old stone markers scattered through the brush. When she backed away, it stopped. In 2022, a researcher from Fayetteville obtained permission to examine the Caldwell recording again. During a high-resolution restoration, he noticed faint sounds buried under the static, not random noise, but the low murmur of overlapping voices. The words were too distorted to decipher, but one phrase seemed to repeat, "paid in full." He didn't complete his analysis. The project file was deleted from the university's system within a week, logged only as corrupted data. Today, hikers who stumble near the area often describe a strange illusion in the fog. A glimpse of what looks like a wooden storefront through the trees, lit by a soft amber glow. Most say it vanishes when approached. A few claim to hear a door creak open and close once, very gently, followed by silence. Locals avoid the place altogether. Even hunters won't cross that ridge. They say it isn't haunted in the way of ghosts or wailing spirits. It's quieter than that. More deliberate. As if the hollow is still doing what it was built to do, taking accounts, keeping balance. And so the records end where they began, with a merchant's promise and an empty page. The ledgers remain sealed, the receipts unsigned, the soil shifting and alive. The post itself may be long buried, but somewhere under the weight of the Ozark Mountains, the debt of Gentry Hollow waits, unpaid, unclosed, and still collecting. All accounts balanced. The final ledger read, but no one ever confirmed who signed it or if it was ever meant for the living.